Welcome, everybody. We're glad you could come to the meeting today. Let's see. All right. Especially you didn't need to drive in all the heat to get here, so that might be advantageous. Hope everybody is doing as well as possible and that you haven't met up with that virus. I know that someone in my family did, nobody locally, but for all of the warnings that we get, this 31-year-old in Florida and his wife have been leading their lives like young people without thinking, and they're both sick. So we're hoping they get better and that they do not spread it. Anyway, on a better note, we have with us today for our program Dr. Christian Kammerer from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh. He has agreed to come and be our speaker. Dr. Kammerer is the research curator in paleontology at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And after getting his doctorate in evolutionary biology at the University of Chicago, he worked as a postdoctoral research fellow at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And he also has worked at the Museum for Naturkunde in Berlin. His research focus is on the vertebrates of the Permian and Triassic periods, with particular emphasis on the early relatives of mammals. So his talk today is Dicynodonts, Tusked Survivors of the Permo-Triassic. Dr. Kammerer, it's all yours, and he will be sharing his screen. We will have questions afterwards, and then at that time, people can unmute themselves. So, Dr. Kammerer.
All right. Thank you so much.
Can you wait a minute? Let me mute everybody and then unmute you, okay?
Oh, sure thing.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Diane. Wonderful to be able to see so many fellow fossil enthusiasts, even if only virtually. Today I'm going to be talking about a group of animals that is very near and dear to my heart, which are the Dicynodonts. I've spoken about Dicynodonts briefly in an earlier talk I gave a few years ago now for the Fossil Club, but only in regards to Triassic fossils from North America. And today I'm going to be giving more of sort of an introduction and then a deeper dive into the evolutionary history of the group, and then talking about some of my recent research looking at the anatomy and function of this really fascinating group of animals at the global scale. So they are well known. Actually, they've been found on every continent. They really are a global group. So let's get right into that. Let's see here. And let me make this full screen. Okay, yeah. So Dicynodonts, first, what are they? I think they are becoming increasingly known, but they're still a fairly obscure group of fossils as such things go. So I'm going to start out with a really basic introduction to what this group is, and apologies to those of you who are already very familiar, especially with the Triassic animals. But just start simply, they are amniotes. So like within the vertebrates, land vertebrates are in this group Amniota. That's basically just everything that has a hard-shelled egg or is otherwise living completely on land, or at least ancestrally completely on land. So this is reptiles, birds, and mammals. So fish and amphibians are excluded. And within this big group Amniota, you have two major subgroups, the diapsids, which are most of what are thought of as reptiles nowadays, as well as the birds, and then the synapsids, which have this wonderfully extensive fossil record, but today only have a single group of living forms, which are the mammals. So mammals are the only living synapsids, but if you go into deep time, there were many more, and they're also perhaps much older than you might think. So I mean, we think of the Cenozoic as sort of the age of mammals, the past 66 million years. This is only a tiny slice of both the age of the Earth, the full, more than 4.5 billion years that the Earth has existed. Within that, you have this block of the most recent 550 odd million years called the Phanerozoic. That is as long as any complex life, sort of animals
Christian,
and plants.
Excuse me for a second. Your screen's not showing up full screen. We still have the banner on the right.
Oh, okay. The banner of
Just the for Adobe.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So if it looks
Let me-
all right on yours, go ahead.
Well, I want people to be able to have the.
It looks
That's
like there's
ideal.
just an arrow, like in the middle. You can close that panel.
Okay. Let me try to open it with preview instead and see if that helps. Did that help at all?
No, it's still showing the same.
All right.
I'd
Last
say
thing I
let's
can.
just go ahead. We can
Okay.
we can see it pretty well.
I'm gonna just try one last thing before I do, which is just to open it in Keynote. How's that?
It's still the same on mine. Sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, in that case, I'm just going to go back to Adobe. Sorry.
Just a minute. Some people were saying that the slides were not progressing. So you've just shown two, right? That one and then the next one?
Yes.
Okay.
No, actually, I should be onto this one. Was where we left off.
Okay, because I didn't see that either.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to leave it like this. I'm not going to do it full screen, and you should still be able to see most of it, hopefully. But yeah, do let me know if like things are not visible, or if it's falling behind in terms of the screen share. We're just talking about in the Phanerozoic eon. This is when complex life has existed. The Cenozoic, the age of mammals, only the last 66 odd million years. But synapsid ancestry goes way back into the Paleozoic. And indeed, the non-mammalian synapsids were the dominant groups of life on land, at least in terms of the vertebrates, for around 80 million years, spanning the end of the Carboniferous period, the entirety of the Permian, and then sort of the first half of the Triassic. So these are animals that are variously known, sometimes as mammal-like reptiles, even though they're no longer considered technically to be reptiles, since they're mammal ancestors. And thus sometimes they are called proto-mammals. And they're an extremely diverse group, so huge array of shapes and sizes and ecologies, everything from really tiny insectivores to large predators to some of them quite gigantic herbivores. And as I mentioned before, this group is known from around the world. And the two sort of major groups of synapsids that we recognize are this primitive early group that's sometimes called the pelycosaurs. This is not a natural grouping. This is just a series of primitive taxa outside of this second group, therapsids. Pelycosaurs are probably the best known of the early synapsids because they include animals like Dimetrodon and Adaphosaurus, these iconic sail-backed forms from the early Permian of Texas and Oklahoma. The therapsids are the more derived group, and they are the ones that include the ancestors of mammals. So they show up in the middle Permian and then survive to the present day, with non-mammalian synapsids surviving through the early Cretaceous in the form of a few relictual taxa. They include some big, saber-toothed predators, like this is the skull of a Gorgonopsian, which is one of the major predatory groups of the Permian. But they also include this group Anomodontia, which is the dominant group of herbivores in the middle through late Permian and then into the Triassic. So the Anomodonts include a few sort of obscure early animals, but are best known from their subgroup, the Dicynodonts. The first Dicynodont fossils were found in the Karoo Basin of South Africa in the 1840s, with the first identifiable skull discovered by the colonial geologist Andrew Bain. So South Africa is still the richest region for synapsid fossils worldwide today. Actually, in normal circumstances, I would be down there right now doing work. There's plenty of specimens both in their museums already, and like there's a seemingly infinite number of fossils to be found in the Karoo Basin. Like every time I've gone out and done field work there, have come back with dozens and dozens of like complete skulls and skeletons. It's really a spectacular outcrop. It helps that, like, as you can see, the Karoo Basin covers 2/3 of the total land area of South Africa, and it's all fossiliferous. So really, spectacular for fossil finding. And so it was back in the 1840s when Bain's surveys found this specimen. So it was the first Dicynodont skull to be found, and it shows sort of like the typical morphology of a Dicynodont fossil. They have a relatively short skull, and they lack teeth other than these prominent tusks. So they would have had a turtle-like beak, but they do have these almost walrus-like tusks. And it's a strange thing. It's unlike anything really living today. Bain didn't quite know what to do with it, so he did what a lot of folks did at the time, which was send it to Sir Richard Owen in London, the preeminent anatomist of the time. And Owen, gave it this name of Dicynodon lacerticeps, the name meaning sort of lizard, faced, but 2 dog teeth. And this is something Owens hit on sort of a fundamental truth to the Dicynodonts. Even though Owen was not an evolutionist, he was sort of very opposed to Darwin and his theories. He did recognize that there were some, unmistakably mammalian-like features to Dicynodon. And even though he classified it as a reptile and, said that it would have been lizard-like in its habits, he did note that it was strikingly mammal-like in some characters. And this is something that in a modern systematic framework has been recognized, that Dicynodonts and these other early synapsids are relatives of mammals. Dicynodonts, they are a dead-end lineage. They don't, they did not give rise to mammals. That's a different group, the confusingly named Cynodonts. But Dicynodonts were still quite successful in their day. At first, there were only skulls known of Dicynodonts, and when Owen advised Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, who was the sculptor of these wonderful Victorian models of prehistoric animals that went into the Crystal Palace exposition in London. And a Dicynodon was one of the animals that was chosen for this. So this is really like only the most prominent genera from the very early history of paleontology. So things like Iguanodon, Ichthyosaurus, Megalosaurus, the Irish elk were in this assemblage. And so Dicynodon went in there. But you'll notice it looks a little weird. So because of its turtle-like beak, they reconstructed it as kind of a turtle-like animal, complete with shell, which was just based on inference. There were no skeletons known of it. You can see those models if you do ever have the opportunity to go to the Crystal Palace. The Dicynodon sculptures are still there, still with their turtle-like shells. Nowadays, we know that these were not shelled animals. A recent depiction of a Dicynodont would look more like this. This is some art that was done for a new species of Dicynodont that I described a few years ago, that a paleo artist colleague of mine, Matt Selesky, put together. And so these animals would have probably had naked but sort of soft mammal-like skin, probably not scaly. We don't know whether they had fur or not. There's no preserved fur before the Jurassic, actually. We know it must have evolved sometime before then. Exactly where along the lineage leading to mammals is unclear. Personally, I think it is very unlikely that Dicynodonts were furry, mostly because they lack any of the osteological correlates on the skull for innervation or vascularization needed to have whiskers, for instance. Instead, they seem to have had sort of a horn-covered, a keratinous beak that covered the face as well as the front part of the lower jaw. So would have been very turtle-like in that regard, even though not really others. So Dicynodonts were the dominant herbivores of the Permian period, especially into the late Permian. They are incredibly diverse. There's over 100 species of these animals known from the Permian, and very ecologically diverse as well. Even though Dicynodonts, they do all kind of look samey a bit. They all, they have beaks. Most of them have tusks. A few of them have lost even the tusks and are totally toothless. But in terms of their size, they go across quite a range. So Permian Dicynodonts, the smallest ones are sort of mouse-sized. The largest ones would have been up to rhinoceros-sized. Some of them have a skull that's over 3 feet long. So really, they're doing a lot of different things in their ecosystems, from probably little things that were eating seeds and maybe like roots and shoots to some of the dominant browsers of their era. So in the Permian, Dicynodont fortunes are quite good. However, then they hit the end Permian mass extinction, which is the biggest and most devastating extinction in Earth's history. Its causes are still debated by paleontologists, but the Siberian traps volcanism that was occurring at that point, a mixture of ocean acidification and runaway global warming, and the combination of all of the formerly separate parts of continents, Gondwana and Laurasia, into a single supercontinent, Pangaea, and the concordant elimination of all of the major ocean currents. These factors together seem to have combined to produce this mass extinction. And as you can see in that chart there, which is looking at vertebrate diversity over time, there's a huge dip at the Permo-Triassic mass extinction, somewhere in the neighborhood of between 70 and 80% of all life died out at that time. And Dicynodonts and the rest of the synapses were very hard hit, but as I say in my title, these animals were survivors, and they did make it through to the Triassic. And one of them actually benefited from the extinction enormously. This is, what happened there? Okay. It's this animal, Lystrosaurus. So Lystrosaurus is one of the best known Dicynodonts. It is known from literally thousands of specimens, mostly from South Africa, but also in Argentina, in Antarctica rather, in India, in China, in Mongolia, in Russia. It seems, and in individual localities, Lystrosaurus will often make up roughly 90% of all vertebrate fossils found there. So some of the sites in South Africa in particular are just like chock-a-block Lystrosaurus specimens. It seems to have been very successful at surviving in this very devastated ecosystem that other synapsids could not. It seems to be a somewhat generalized animal in some ways. They were just sort of these squat, sort of mid-sized, sort of pig-like and pig-sized animals. They don't get that big. Largest Lystrosaurus, which is the species Lystrosaurus mckayi, maybe in the 6 foot length, but most of them sort of 3 feet long or so. And they are what is known as a disaster taxon. These are taxa that are generally rare in their ecosystems, but seem to be pre-adapted for disturbed environments. And so once that extinction hits, Lystrosaurus got very lucky and basically like ruled the earth for a few million years. I mean, you could have gone in the earliest Triassic landscape, you could have looked out and seen nothing but endless herds of Lystrosaurus, basically. But as is also typical of disaster taxa, once ecosystems start to stabilize, they then generally die out. And Lystrosaurus, although a great survivor of the extinction, did not survive basically ecosystems coming back to normal. However, that was not it for Dicynodonts in general. So I'm really having trouble with that. Here we go. With Dicynodonts in general, so you have Lystrosaurus in the early Triassic, but another group of Dicynodonts, the Kammerer forms, went on to sort of rediversify throughout the rest of the Triassic. And interestingly, they become quite large in size. So although in terms of species diversity, they sort of get back to reasonable amounts, they never reclaim the full ecological diversity that they had in the Permian. So there's no more of these like little mouse-sized animals. They're all pretty big and getting bigger. So between Lystrosaurus, which is already sort of pig-sized, you then go to animals like Kammerer in the middle Triassic, which is more of an ox-sized animal, to some truly gigantic forms into the late Triassic. In this family, the Stahlicariids, which were mostly known from the Southern Hemisphere, historically known from places like Brazil and Southern Africa. But the last Dicynodont that we know of, which is from the very end of the Triassic, is this animal Lysavitsia that was just described last year. And it is both the last and the largest Dicynodont of all time. This was an elephant-sized animal found in the end Triassic of Poland. So it seems that Dicynodonts, even at the end of the history of their group, were still living worldwide. They may have been fairly rare components of their ecosystems at that point. That's a time when you're seeing mostly other reptiles taking over. So, and certainly there are dinosaurs on the scene at this point. But there's sort of like one last hurrah for the Dicynodonts with this really gigantic form. And certainly, like, even if they were fairly rare, Dicynodonts would have been an important part of the biomass in their ecosystems just based on their role as the largest herbivores. So they survived all throughout the Triassic. They couldn't make it through 2 mass extinctions, though. There's a second Big Five mass extinction at the end of the Triassic-Jurassic event. And that finally does kill them off, and may have helped allow dinosaur herbivores to really cement themselves as the dominant plant eaters moving into the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, and of course achieve the greatest sizes of any land-based animal. So this was a little introduction to Dicynodont history and sort of their biology. But now I'd like to get into some of the research that I've been doing on Dicynodonts lately, including looking more at their sort of functional morphology and aspects of their ecology. And to do that, we're going to look a bit at burrowing adaptations in Dicynodonts. So I've spoken a lot about how ecologically diverse this group is, from very small to very large animals. But that's also true in terms of their locomotion and their life habits. So some Dicynodonts were burrowers. We know this for sure because we have found them in their burrows. So at left here, if you can see that is a burrow cast from the late Permian in South Africa of an animal called Dicynodon, which is one of the most common of all Dicynodonts. This is also an animal known from literally thousands of specimens, which is remarkable for a Paleozoic taxon of any vertebrate at least. And skeletons of Dicynodon have been found, curled up in the terminal chambers, the living chambers of these these burrows. So we know that they were living in burrows. The scratches on the sides of the burrows have even been matched to the morphology of Dicynodon claws. So we know that they were making the burrows as well. However, were they active like fossorial animals? So, I mean, there are plenty of animals today that live in dens. They overnight in dens, but they're not full-time burrowers. Foxes maybe are the most obvious example. Foxes don't feed underground, but they do overnight underground. But even animals that you wouldn't expect, like warthogs, they live in dens. And they sleep there at night, and then obviously they're out grazing during the day. So these are not fossorial animals. When I talk about a truly burrowing creature, I mean something like a mole. This is an animal that lives underground all the time, comes up only rarely. It's feeding underground, it's breeding underground. This is a truly fossorial animal. And this is a habitus that has appeared convergently in a number of different groups of mammals. These sort of squat, almost sausage-shaped underground dwellers with large paws, almost paddle-like paws, and greatly reduced eyesight, so that these animals are effectively blind in many cases. So not only the moles that we're familiar with in the northern hemisphere, but also an unrelated group of small insectivores, these so-called golden moles that live in southern Africa. And then in a remarkable case of convergence, the marsupial mole, this animal Notorictes, that is, like many of the modern marsupial groups, restricted to Australia. So all of these animals, they look very similar. They all have external convergent features. But thankfully for us paleontologists who don't have whole bodies to work with, they have some very strong indicators of their fossorial lifestyle in the skeleton. So if you look at a mole, that's the arm bone on the left there, the humerus. And when you think of it in comparison to our humeri, or a typical mammalian humerus, it's a very bizarre shape. It's extremely short and squat. It has these enormous hook-like condyles for really powerful muscular attachment coming off of the sides. The elbow bone of the mole is also fairly bizarre. So if you look at the ulna, I've put in a little arrow pointing to the olecranon process, which is also a muscle attachment site. And it's simply enormous. So like when we hit our funny bone, it's a rare event, albeit painful. But thankfully it's not that often, because our olecranon process is very short. We don't have this sort of huge lobe of bone sticking off, because regardless of how much we might work out our sort of inch for inch, centimeter for centimeter, the power in our arms cannot compare even slightly to that of a mole. They are perpetually using their limbs to move through solid earth. And their anatomy is very highly adapted for that purpose. And this is what you see in all of these convergent mole-like creatures. So if you look at the marsupial mole skeleton there's its humerus on the left. It's also this really weird shortened squat form with these giant condyles. Its ulna on the right, so that big hook-like structure at the top is also a hypertrophied, a super elongated olecranon process. And thanks to these features, we can identify habitually digging animals in the fossil record as well. So if you look at this Jurassic mammal, this is an animal called Frutofosser from Fruta, Colorado. This was an animal that would have coexisted with things like Allosaurus or Brachiosaurus diplodocus, these great dinosaur fossils from the late Jurassic of the American West. It has that very bizarre style of humerus and also that massive olecranon process. The hands and feet also have these very flattened claws, these very broadened phalanges, giving it that paddle-like appearance, giving it sort of the shovel-like power for digging through the earth. So are there any Dicynodonts that show this same feature that suggest that they were fully fossorial? And the answer is yes. So there is this group the cysticephalids from Gondwana. They are best known from South Africa, like most Dicynodonts, but specimens have been found in Tanzania and Zambia, and I actually recently described the first known cysticephalid from India as well. So they were probably throughout Gondwana. And the ecology of this group was, for most of the 20th century, quite enigmatic. There was the suggestion, which has been illustrated here. This is a piece of artwork in the Russian National Museum in Moscow, showing it as an almost primate-like creature, sort of like a slow loris or a sloth clambering through the trees. And they do have very frontated, almost binocular vision. So this is not totally out of left field, but we now know is greatly incorrect. When you look at complete cysticephalid skeletons, as are now known, they have these sort of elongate, very sausage-like morphologies, similar in gross appearance to some other living, fully fossorial mammals. And if you start looking at their limb anatomy, you see that same set of very stereotyped features that you see in moles. It has this broad paddle-like hand with these very robust but broadened claws, this very short, squat humerus with these giant condyles on it, and an enormous olecranon on the ulna. So these are all very, characteristic indicators of fossoriality. So it's now fairly well established that cysticephalids were full-time burrowers. They were living underground. They were probably feeding on rootstocks or like fern rhizomes underground, maybe also being somewhat insectivorous, eating worms and such. What has not been looked at really is the skull morphology of this group and how that relates to the inferred digging lifestyle. So it has been noted that they have kind of these boxy skulls, but that doesn't tell you a huge amount, as you've already seen. Some previous scientists use this as an argument for them living in trees. However, in my own studies on Dicynodonts, I've noted something that I thought is very interesting about the skulls of these cysticephalids, and that's actually the nature of the sutures. So it's not just the shape of the skull, but if you map the sutures between the different bones making up the cranium onto a cysticephalid, there's something very interesting there, which is that they are very strongly interdigitated. So this is a very complex suture. So if you look at it, it's like super squiggly. This is a remarkable amount of interdigitation or interfingering between the various bones, especially this bone, the nasal, which makes up the snout, and the frontal, which is between the eyeballs on these things. And this is not sort of a one-off event. If you look at every cysticephalid specimen, they all have these super interdigitated cranial sutures. So what's going on with that? Well, for that, we actually can look to functional anatomy in living animals. And what animals have very complex cranial sutures? Well, there's been some classic work done by Sue Herring and Catherine Jaslow on suture complexity in pigs and goats. And they showed that increase in sutural complexity is closely tied to dealing with increased stresses in these animals. So the sutures between bones that are dealing with the greatest amount of stress and strain in their day-to-day life are the most complex. So in a pig, it's also the nasofrontal suture, because these are animals that are rooting in the ground. That part of the skull is constantly being pushed against the substrate and constantly straining the snout. In goats, it is between the frontal and the parietal, because that's where they are bashing their skulls together, or otherwise using their horns to interact with their environments and putting really huge compressive stresses on the skull. Of course, neither pigs nor goats are burrowing animals, but let's look at a burrower. So these are CT scans of the skulls of some amphisbaenians. These are worm lizards. Worm lizards are mostly limbless, fully fossorial living reptiles, and they exclusively use their heads to burrow through the ground. So their head is basically used as a wedge. In some animals like anops at the top there, it is very wedge shaped, and they just press with the skull against the substrate and use that to burrow through. And what you can hopefully see in these CT scans is that they have incredibly highly interdigitated nasofrontal sutures. So it's almost exactly what you see in the cystocephalids. So just comparing cystocephalus on the left there and one of these worm lizards on the right. So this is what you would expect if the cystocephalids were also using their head to burrow through the earth. So this is a previously unnoted and unrecognized aspect of cystocephalid paleobiology, that the skull is probably as important of a tool for them in interacting with the substrate and being fossorial as these powerful limbs. And they seem to show intermediate between reptilian burrowers, which are mostly sort of snake-shaped and undulatory and using their head to burrow, and mammalian burrowers like moles, which are mostly using the limbs to burrow, which I guess on some level is not surprising because these synapsids are, in their general anatomy, they are intermediate between reptiles and mammals in a lot of ways. One thing you might ask is, is this sutural pattern really that unusual for Dicynodonts? Is it like, are we overstepping our inferences here with cystocephalids? Or is this just sort of a Dicynodont-wide thing? And we can actually test that statistically. So if you look at some of the other Dicynodonts, including this really beautifully preserved skull, this is Dicynodonts from the late Permian of Russia. You can map the sutural complexity patterns onto these two skulls, and what you should clearly see is that Dicynodonts has, very simple, very smooth suture. Same in an animal that's much more closely related to cystocephalids, this animal Compsodon, has almost totally simple, just sort of kind of W-shaped suture. And we can look at this quantitatively as well. So I did this with a data set of around 300 Dicynodonts that had very well-preserved sutures. Taking the total length in this line here versus the least length. So using that ratio to represent complexity. So the squigglier it is relative to basically as the crow flies, the more complex of a number we get there. And so when you look across all Dicynodonts, the three cystocephalids genera are all the way to the right here. They have quite significantly the most complex sutures. So there's a sharp drop-off between the cystocephalids that have been inferred as burrowers and all the other Dicynodont groups. So it really does seem to be something quite special and unique about cystocephalids. With that said, if you do look at the next most complex one, it also sort of fits the pattern because it's this animal Dicynodon, which, as we already discussed, did live in burrows. We don't think that it was habitually fossorial. We think Dicynodon probably was denning and then coming up to the surface to feed. But it still would have had to be digging, and it has, some real complexity to that suture, but not nearly as complex as the cystocephalids. So it fits in with the idea that this is a somewhat of a gradation between the different groups, but is definitely developed to an extreme in the cystocephalids, as you can see there. And it really only seems to have evolved quite rapidly. If you look at a phylogeny, evolutionary tree of all Dicynodonts, cystocephalids I show in red there. They're this member of the group, the Emidopoids. And their closest relative is this animal called Myosaurus, which is another small Dicynodont. But if we look at the skull of Myosaurus, it does not have complex sutures. Indeed, it actually has one of the lowest values for sutural complexity in this analysis. So Myosaurus probably was not habitually burrowing underground. And it signifies that even in very closely related Dicynodont groups, there could have been substantial ecological diversity. That's one of the things I've been working on. Just to very briefly, before I open up the floor for questions, Want to note that Dicynodont discoveries are ongoing just in terms of new species. There is a huge amount of Dicynodont fossils out there, and more fossils are being found basically whenever people look in South Africa, but also elsewhere. And increasingly, Dicynodonts are being found in understudied Permian and Triassic basins around the world. So this is just a quick overview. These are the Dicynodonts that have been named in the past 5 years. And many of them are from places that historically were understudied. So like Rostodon is from Brazil. Repelinosaurus was described from Laos. Lysovicia is this animal from Poland. So they are being found more and more worldwide. But also the major stumbling block towards the description of new Dicynodont species is largely worker effort. So one thing that you'll notice about all these is that I described more than half of all Dicynodonts from the past 5 years, and basically all the other ones were described by my colleague Ken Angelsic at the Field Museum. So we're really the only two people who work on Dicynodont taxonomy with any regularity. So it is very much just like a matter of our personal professional schedules as to how many Dicynodonts are being described. So we're definitely trying to spread the word about how wonderful of a group Dicynodonts are, how interesting sort of the biological and deep time questions you can answer with them with this huge data set are, and encouraging students who are interested in going into paleontology to give Dicynodonts a look, and hopefully get some more Dicynodont workers out there, especially as the volume of specimens has become overwhelming. Especially there have been, in addition to South Africa, where as I said, thousands of specimens of Dicynodonts, recent expeditions in Zambia and Tanzania, which have smaller but also very fossiliferous rift basins there, have yielded hundreds of new taxa and hundreds of new specimens representing probably dozens of new taxa. Most of these actually were collected by my colleague Ken and groups from South African Museum and from the Burke Museum in Seattle. And there is just a huge number of new species there. We found a few taxa, like this is an animal that we named Eutychignathus a few years back, that are found in all of the major basins, so in South Africa, Zambia, and Tanzania, but most of them seem to be basinal endemics. So if it's found in South Africa, the same species is not being found in Zambia, which is not being found in Tanzania. So there are some closely related animals, but most of them are endemic, and most of the ones being found there are new and still awaiting description, so I've got, papers in varying degrees of completeness for around 12 new species from Zambia, Ken probably has an equal number, but there's many on top of that we still need to get around to. To say nothing, just to pull it back to North Carolina, to say nothing of what's going on locally, I discovered the first complete Dicynodont from North Carolina a few years back, and this specimen is currently in the basement at the Museum of Natural Sciences awaiting preparation. But with all of that on hold at the moment, I have no idea when it'll actually get around to being, fully uncovered and described. But it is there, so there's something to look forward to. And I'm certain there's more of these animals in the local rocks. Dicynodonts historically are very rare from North America, really only known from this one animal, Placerius, which is more or less known from a single site in the American Southwest. There are a few other scraps, but 99% of all Placerius fossils are from one place in St. John's, Arizona, called the Placerius Quarry. So they're not found often, but when you do find them locally, they can be super abundant. So I'm sure there are other Dicynodont skeletons somewhere in the Pekin-Kumnick formations of central North Carolina, and look forward to finding them when that is possible again. So with that, let me just close up. Thank you all for coming. And also just to highlight that Dicynodont fossils are, being found in new and interesting places. These are some cartoons. Recently, the first fragment of a Dicynodont was found in the Triassic of Japan, and the local village there immediately adopted it as the town mascot, naming it Mine-dan of Mine City. So the Dicynodont love spreading globally, and hope that people around the world have a little more respect for these remarkable survivors of 80 odd million years. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
So Dr. Kammerer, there is one question in the chat box. If you'll take a look at that, and then if
from Melanie.
Yeah, if you have any other questions, you can unmute yourself and ask those questions. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just address that first one as to why they grew larger in size. It seems to be an effect of competition with reptiles, and especially this group, the archosaurs, so crocodiles, dinosaurs, and their close relatives. After the Permo-Triassic mass extinction, synapsids they're decimated. There are a few stragglers, some of these Dicynodonts and the ancestors of mammals that make it through. And they do go on to re-diversify, but they never reclaim the same sort of ecological heft and abundance, the same degree of dominance in ecosystems that they had in the Permian. And one thing that happens quite quickly is that reptiles and archosaurs take over small to mid-sized herbivore roles. There's this group called the rhynchosaurs, which are beaked reptiles that become quite common in the middle Triassic, and really seem to dominate these small-bodied herbivore roles that Dicynodonts formerly held. So the surviving...
Is that what you said?
Yeah, rhynchosaurs. So they're archosauromorphs. They are not quite archosaurs, but they're closest to sort of the archosaur line of the of the major reptile groups. But yeah, rhynchosaurs. There's also this other group, trilophosaurs, that are very common at those body sizes. So it seems like Dicynodonts are being squeezed out of ecospace a little bit. They're being outcompeted in some of these niches. And one of the things that they're doing is, taking over larger and larger body sizes that reptiles are just not filling at that time, and would not fill until the origin of true dinosaurs at the end of the Triassic, when you first see things like sauropodomorphs like Plateosaurus and Massospondylus and its ilk starting to appear.
I also would like to ask about Lystrosaurus. Why would they just begin to die off as the ecosystem began to recover?
Well, yeah, go ahead.
And because you said that they were the kind of animal that is pretty adapted for a very disturbed ecosystem.
Yes.
Why would they begin to die off as ecosystems begin to recover? Competition, perhaps? Competition, predators?
Competitions in part, but also just they don't seem to have been super well adapted for also the changes in flora that were happening at the time. So in addition to the animal extinctions at the Permo-Triassic event, you go from having plants that are mostly dominated, at least in the southern hemisphere, by this group called the Glossopterids, as well as things like horsetails and ferns, to going into gymnosperms, things like ginkgo, into the Triassic. So it's the Lystrosaurs. They were some kind of rooting animals. We still don't have a great handle on sort of just what they were eating, because it's very hard to infer in an animal that has essentially no teeth other than the tusks and no tooth wear, to look at micro wear as to whether it's very resistant vegetation. But just based on sort of what has been found in their environments, these are rooting animals. They're pulling rhizomes out of things like ferns and horsetails. And as the Triassic gets drier and drier, and some of these other plant groups become dominant, those potential foods are not as common anymore. So between that and competition with reptiles, it seems Lystrosaurus just could not keep up.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir.
There's
we
one
got
more
a-
question in the chat too.
Yeah. So have we ever found more than one cysticephalus in the same burrow? So actually, cysticephalus itself has never been described from a burrow. I have found a cysticephalus in its burrow while in the field in South Africa. It is still out there to my knowledge. We did not have the permit to collect it at the time. So there's never been a paper describing cysticephalus in the burrow. All of the burrow casts that have been found are either of Dicynodon or Lystrosaurus, actually. So Lystrosaurus was also capable of building dens, at least. Also probably, would not have been a habitual, like a fossorial animal. So cysticephalus, we know anatomically that they were burrowing, and now I have one example of it in a burrow, but we know almost nothing about their social structure. So most of the cysticephalid fossils are disarticulated. They are just an isolated skull or isolated skeletal material that's being pulled apart in these floodplains where they were living in the Karoo Basin. I would not be surprised if they were social to some degree, but currently there's no way to say exactly how much that is, and certainly no evidence for eusociality in them like there is in mole rats. Although certainly it's a possibility. We just need more data.
So does anybody else have any other questions? If so, you can unmute yourself.
Mike, I've got a question for Charlie Causey, if it's okay to ask.
Oh, please go ahead.
Absolutely.
Dr. Kammerer, and you may have touched on this and maybe I missed it, but you mentioned that most of these animals are rather, have a beak and are pretty much toothless except for these tusks, but the tusks are pretty widespread throughout the group. Do you know what function or what purpose the tusks may have served?
Yeah, great question. And at least some of them, we're pretty sure it was for display. In Dicynodon, at least, the sexes do have, one has tusks and one doesn't. So in Dicynodon, there's basically a 50-50 split. Once you get skulls greater than 4 centimeters long, they either have tusks or they don't. And sometimes you'll find a burrow with a tusked Dicynodon and a tuskless Dicynodon in the same den. So it seems pretty clear that these are males and females. If they're anything like modern mammals, it's probably the males that have tusks and females that don't, but we obviously can't say that for sure so deep into the fossil record. If they were more reptile-like, it's possible that the females were the ones that had the tusks. But in Dicynodon, at least, it's a sexually dimorphic, sexually selected feature. With that said, there are other groups of Dicynodonts, like Dicynodon itself, that original genus described by Owen, where every single specimen has tusks. So we know it's not anything with dimorphism there. In those animals, you do have wear facets on the tusks. So the internal surface of the tusk, it's simple. It's just like someone sort of lopped off an edge to it, but clearly it is being pushed against the lower jaw during eating. So Lystrosaurus also always has tusks. And so we think the Dicynodonts that were doing more rooting, that were eating more sort of like roots and rhizomes, were using the tusks to help pull those things out of the ground and to process them to an extent. So, it's a diverse group, different species probably doing different things, but it was functional in at least some of them.
Thank you very much. Could I ask one more question about anatomy?
Yeah.
Some of your illustrations, particularly of the earlier species, show, at least for the front limbs, that they're pretty splayed, much like an alligator, crocodile, a lot of the other reptiles. But in some of your later illustrations, they almost become straighter, more mammal-like. Did the way the front limbs, particularly the way they're splayed, or as opposed to straight, did that change with time?
It did. So that's a good observation, because those illustrations are accurate in that regard. So ancestrally, synapsids have a very crocodilian-like gait, so they would have been sprawling, but probably capable of sort of like the gator's high walk. In the therapsids, they have this very strange intermediate morphology where the front limbs are splayed outwards, but the hind limbs are essentially erect. So they're sort of like, you know, kind of wheelbarrow motion halfway. Within Dicynodonts, though, as they get larger, the gait becomes more and more erect. In the Permian ones, they're quite splayed out, would have been sprawling. In the Triassic forms, you see there's a shift in angulation of the limbs when you look at sort of like the head of the femur and the head of the humerus where it fits into the shoulder socket. It's a much more vertical orientation. So in the latest Dicynodonts, the really giant ones like Stalacaria and Lysavitia, these would have had, you know, very mammalian style gait, but having evolved that independently of true mammals.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Good question.
Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Kammerer. That was fascinating. We can all clap.
Oh, well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
We really enjoyed listening and seeing your graphics and so forth. So thank you very much. And thank you for doing it by Zoom.
Yeah, it's, you know, it is what it is until we can be there in person again.
Okay, so what we'll do right now is take a 5-minute break, and then we will come back for the business meeting. And before we leave, I'm just going to mention that we still need one more person for the meeting committee. And I'll remind you that the president is allowed to appoint. So if you'd like to volunteer, let me know. And if nobody volunteers, I will appoint. So see you in 5 minutes. I have that it's 2:27. So we'll come back at a little after 2:30, 2:35, 2:32. All right.